What is up, creators? I hope you're having a very nice end to the year. Today, we're returning to the Airlight series where we break down the styles of famous photographers, creators, movies, or just color grading and try to replicate it in post-edition with the only purpose of learning how to color grade. Now, the style that we're going to break down today is the LomoChrome 92. Now, this negative film has a very intense contrast plus some fascinating changes in the hues of the blues and the greens, and it was suggested by one of you guys in a previous video by Jonas. So if you have any other suggestions of styles that you want me to break down, put it down and I'll check them out. So we're going to jump into some examples firstly to analyze and look at the characteristics of this film stock, and then we're going to apply that knowledge into editing a digital photo and creating a preset out of it. So let's get going. So in the original message, Jonas didn't ask for the LomoChrome 92 specifically. Instead, he was asking for the more eclectic or dramatic styles from lomography, like the turquoise over here. And this one is just out of the world. It's just something very bizarre and very strange. And I'm afraid that in order to create an edit like this one, we would have to use several layers within Lightroom or jump into Photoshop. That would be the easiest way. So instead, we're going to concentrate in the LomoChrome 92, which is it's a bit more nailed back, but still a very interesting style. So here we have this first example image, and starting out, the LomoChrome 92 doesn't have the best latitude or the best dynamic range. Instead, it has very harsh contrast. We can see loads of loss of information in the shadows, and also in bright exposures, we lose some detail or some clipping in the highlights. So we have to keep that in mind. Then the skin tones aren't the best, but it is workable. So what it lacks in latitude, it really makes up in some colors. For example, the blues are very saturated and very vibrant. Also, the reds are very dominant, but they're taking a bit more towards the magentas. Meanwhile, the greens are also very present in this film stock, but they're taking a bit more towards the cooler tones. Instead, what I normally like to do is change them towards the warmer tones. Right here, we can see them more towards the emeralds. Now in this article on DP Review, where they're reviewing this film stock, you can notice what we mentioned, the high contrast, also the blue is very intense, but notice how the dark parts of the image, the shadows, and also a bit of the midtones have a bit of a green yellowish undertone added, and this is done in color grading. So in essence, what it's doing is adding this cool tone in the highlights, making this film stock quite cool in general, but also contrasting it with this warm tone added in the shadows. So it's not the best in harsh contrasty environments, but in well-lit environments, right here we have this beautiful portrait. We can see that the white table is acting like a reflector to brighten up the faces of the subjects. And you can notice that it performs quite nicely. Also notice that the grain is very big and very contrasty. We have to keep that in mind. But then in situations where there's a lot more contrast, like in the exteriors, we can notice how the shadows are very deep. They lose a lot of information, but also the bright parts of the image are basically clipping. So we have to keep that in mind. Other than that, we can see those intense blues in the skies, those greens changing towards the emeralds, and those reds very vibrant as well. So this film stock, as the name says, it's LomoChrome 92 referring to the early 90s, is trying to replicate a bit of, or create a bit of nostalgia from that time. So if you're like me and you were born around that time, you can check out some old photos of you as a baby, and probably they look quite similar to this one. So I think I have everything I need, all the characteristics. So we're going to jump into Lightroom and start editing. But before that, as always, I'm going to remind you that these presets that we're going to create today, I'm going to add them to the Edit preset pack V3 and also the analog preset pack. Link up here to both of them in my shop in case you want to support me. In those preset packs, we're going to continue to add more styles as we continue to create more videos in the Edit series. So if you can support me, I'll be very thankful. If not, don't worry guys, let's jump into Lightroom and start editing. Okay, creators, here I have this collection that I use for basically for all the analog presets that we create. And I added these ones that are shot at midday because, well, the LomoChrome 92 is created for daylight photography. So I'm just gonna select, I think this one that pains me, it's a bit cringe, but hey, we were all young, we all took terrible photos and terrible photos of ourselves. But I'm gonna use this one because we have greens, we have blues, and we have some skin tones to work with. So if you're familiar with my Edit series, you know that I like to work first of all with the exposure and contrast using the basic corrections, the presence tab and the tone curve, and then I moved down to the color grading tools like HSL, color grading and camera calibration. Now in this tutorial, like in many, I do repeat myself quite a lot if you're familiar with the series, and that's because I don't know if they're new users that are just getting into Lightroom or they may be a bit more advanced, so I like to include as much of information as I can into these tutorials, though it can be a bit repetitive. So sorry guys if you're familiar with all these things that I'm already saying. So first of all, exposure and contrast. So we're going to use the basic corrections as the first layer on our exposure and contrast, and then the tone curve to stylize our look. So first of all, highlights and shadows. Now, I did mention in the analysis that this style is very punchy and contrasty, but in this case, I'm just going to pull the sliders up so we have a bit more latitude or dynamic range. After all, we are talking about film photography, which is known for preserving very well the highlights and the shadows. So I'm going to bring them up just a bit, the shadows, not plus the 50%, otherwise this image has way too much information. We're just going to bring it ever so slightly around the plus 35. Meanwhile, the highlights, I'm just going to move them down towards the negatives so we have more information in the bright parts of the image, slightly around the minus 14. Nothing too extreme, guys, just making the image a bit more, with a bit more information compared to the original. Then whites and blacks will control the extremes. Whites control the brightest part on our image, meanwhile blacks the darkest part on our image. So in this case, whites, I'm just going to reduce them just a bit, around the minus 5 is going to be enough. Meanwhile, the blacks, we want to move them towards the negatives to achieve more contrast. Notice how I move towards the negatives and everything becomes a bit deeper, a bit more contrasty. So this is way too high. Maybe around the minus 15 is going to be enough just to retain the contrast that we lost while raising the shadows. So compared to the original, as you can see, the image is still having a very punchy look, but we have a bit more of a brighter image with loads more information in the shadows. Now this is going to change when we move down to the tone curve. But before we jump into the tone curve, we have the presence tab. Now right here, we're going to move clarity and texture, and we're not going to move them towards the positives, otherwise we obtain a very digitally sharp and contrasty image. We want to go a bit towards the negatives just to replicate the style of old cameras, old lenses that weren't as sharp as the lenses that you can buy today. So clarity towards the negatives to make the image a bit less contrasty, and texture as well towards the negatives, ever so slightly around the minus 7% to reduce a bit of the sharpness. Then the dehaze tool is originally created for landscape photographies to aid them when maybe the landscape has a bit of haze or a bit of mist. With the dehaze tool towards the positives, you can cut that out and achieve more contrast. But in this case, I'm going to go towards the negatives. As you can see, if I go towards the negatives, all bright parts of the image start to glow just a bit. Now this is way too extreme, but this is a side effect of the dehaze, creating a similar effect to the halation on old cameras or old lenses or the diffusion filter in modern cameras. Now, apart from the glowing effect, you can notice how the saturation on the colors is being altered to more of a pastel look. So we don't want to go towards the extreme. This is ridiculous. Around the minus 20 is just going to be enough, just adding a little bit of glowing effect into the bright parts of the image and reducing a bit of the saturation on the colors. Okay, now we're going to finalize our exposure and contrast with the tone curve. Now the tone curve is a very powerful tool that allows us to control the exposure and contrast, but also if you like to color grade with the tone curve, you can use the RGB channels, but you have to keep in mind that by moving these points up and down, you're not only altering the color, you're also altering the exposure and contrast. So that's why I don't like to use the tone curve for color grading minus specific cases. So I'm just going to reset this. And also right here, we have the parametric tone curve that acts in a very similar way to the basic corrections. I sometimes use the parametric tone curve to correct my image. And then to create a stylized look, I use the point tone curve that we have over here. And the point tone curve is the one that's going to help us to fade out those blacks and achieve a punchy looking image. So I'm going to create a point in the shadows over here and a point in the highlights. Now, as you can see, this tone curve is basically a diagonal. Up here we have the whites, down here we have the black. So any point that we move up, like the shadows over here, we're gonna add more exposure. If we move it down, we're gonna take away some brightness. So we have to keep that in mind with the tone curve always. So the shadows, I'm just gonna bring them down just a bit below the diagonal. Notice immediately how our image is a lot more contrasty if we move it down, just a few slots, something like this position. And if you're not too sure where to place this point, you can always look at the input settings that I selected over here and the output. Input is basically the x-axis, output is the y-axis. So in essence, this is the coordinates for this point, 50 and 39. So right here we have the contrast. Now, another thing that we're missing is those faded out blacks, because in the example images, we never saw pure blacks. We saw them that they were a bit grayed out. This point over here will control the blacks. So I'm going to raise it above the diagonal and notice immediately how the blacks become a lot more gray. If you compare it to the interface of Instagram, they're basically gone. This is way too high, maybe around this value over here, a plus 25. And as you can see with Y on our keyboard, we have a punchy looking image and we have those blacks compared to the original, which are a lot more grayish, a lot more bright. So this is what we wanted to achieve here. And then this point in the highlights is just basically acting as an anchor. So this movement that we did in the shadows isn't affecting the bright parts or the midtones. We're retaining bright highlights, which is in essence what we want to achieve high contrast. What happens if we remove this point? You can see if I delete this point, the bright parts of the image and the midtones have a lot more information because they're being darkened by this tone curve. And this isn't what we want. We want a more contrasty look. So we're gonna return this point so we have brighter exposure. So there we have our exposure and contrast. Now we're gonna move down to the color grading. Now for color grading, we're gonna start off with camera calibration, which is by default the bottom tool that we have over here. And camera calibration will allow us to control the RGB, the red, the green, and the blue, which are the three colors that create every single pixel that we have in digital photography. So if I alter the blue primary, we're going to alter every single color on our image. So this is a tool which is very powerful and we need to move it in a very delicate manner. So first of all, as a reminder, remember that we wanted the reds towards the magentas. We don't want to go towards the positives in the tonality or the hue because we end up with a lot more oranges in our image. You can notice how every single color is affected because every single color in our image is composed in higher or lesser percent with some red. So as you can see, the greens are affected a lot because they contain a lot of yellow and red. So we don't want to go towards the positives, we want to go towards the negatives to the magentas. So the value is going to be around the -24. As a result, you can notice how the skin tones tend towards more of a pink-like color instead of an orangey yellow. And then the saturation, I'm just going to bring it down ever so slightly on the -10, just to reduce a bit of the saturation and start to obtain those pastel-like colors. Next, we're going to move the greens. Now, before we jump into the green primary and the blue primary, I want you guys to understand that camera calibration works with complementary colors and color contrast. What I mean by that is that by moving the green primary, the red primary, or the blue primary, we're affecting, yes, the blues, the greens, and the reds, every single other color, but the other color that's going to be affected by moving every slider is the direct opposite in the color wheel. So as you can see, the green primary and the blue primary over here, in the color wheel, the blues are direct opposite from the yellows. So if I move the blue primary, all the colors are going to be affected, but the blue is going to be the color that is most affected, and also the direct opposite, the complementary color, which is the yellow. If I move the green primary, the greens are going to be very harshly affected, but also the magentas, which are direct opposites. Now, why is this important? Because the magentas are in the skin tones of most of the subjects, particularly if you're Caucasian or white, you're going to have a lot of magentas, as you can see over here. My ears are in the magenta range, as are my lips, or any blushiness. So we have to keep that in mind, and that's why I don't like to move the green primary in the extreme, because most of the skin tones of myself are in that range. So in order to achieve the greens that we wanted, or the LomoChrome 92 greens, we want to go towards the positives. But if we go towards the positives to achieve those emerald greens, notice how the magentas in the skin are really starting to shine. It's way too much. We're affecting too much the skin tones. So instead of moving it in camera calibration, I'm going to move them in HSL. And I'm going to be a bit more conservative with the green primary in camera calibration. Just moving ever so slightly up, so we're not affecting too much the magentas, but we are affecting a bit of the palette towards the emerald colors, just around the +8. And then I'm going to bring down a bit of the vibrance with a -5 in the saturation. Then the blue primary, as I mentioned, will control the blues, but also the yellow. So as you can see, if I pull up the saturation, I move the hue, we're affecting a lot of the skin tones, a lot of the sky, but also the vegetation, because, well, the vegetation contains a lot of yellow. So this is way too harsh. I'm not going to move it. What I'm going to do is just desaturate a bit of the blue primary so we don't have those yellow skin tones. We want more towards the magentas, and just desaturate the skin tones just a little bit, as we saw in the example portraits, but also we're achieving a bit more of that pastel look. Okay, so that's enough for camera calibration. I don't want to go too into detail to this tool. I already made a tutorial about it, link up here in case you want to check it out. Let's move up to HSL and just fine tune some of the colors and the saturation. So HSL, previously known as HSL, now it's known as color mixer because we have the mixer and point color as well, but HSL is still here where we alter the hue, saturation, and luminance of each color. So continuing our endeavor to achieve those emerald greens, we're going to move the green and the yellow. As you can see, these greens are controlled by the greens as well, the green slider, but also the yellow slider. So we're going to go towards the positives, taking them towards the cooler tones. So maybe around the +57 is going to be for the greens, and then the yellows towards the +66. And right here we have very saturated and very vibrant emerald greens. And don't worry, we're still going to desaturate a bit of these tones. But right here we have the greens that we wanted in our image. Then the reds, I'm not going to move them, but I am going to move the oranges just a bit towards the brick-like colors. And this is just trying to achieve the skin tones that we saw in the example images. Notice how I move towards the negatives, we achieve magenta skin tones. Towards the positives, a bit more orangey. So I'm not going to move it too much, just going to retain them around the plus 17 to make them a bit more yellow. Then, in case we have any magentas on our image in lips or in clothing, we want to take them towards the cooler tones, not towards the warmer tones, reddish tones. So in this case, cooler is towards the negatives, towards the blues. So we're just going to go ever so slightly towards the negatives. Both of them are in the minus 12 or 13% is going to be enough. So the image is looking very vibrant, very saturated, way too much. So we're going to move down to saturation. And here we're basically going to make our colors a bit less dominant, a bit more flat, like we saw in most of the example images. So first of all, the greens are way too saturated. So just going to move the saturation of the yellow or the minus 30%, as well as the greens, just taking a bit more relevance out of them. And then what we are going to do is add more saturation to the blues in the sky and the aquas in the water. So saturation in the blues towards the positives, and also the aquas towards the positives. With Y on our keyboard, we can see the difference. Now we have more muted and emerald greens, more saturated and vibrant blues, and we have those skin tones less towards the oranges, less saturated, like we saw in the example images. Like the LomoChrome isn't the best preset for portrait photography because it does produce very desaturated and muted skin tones. But in general terms, we are getting there. Okay, next up in the color grading department, the last step is going to be, well, the tool which is known as color grading, previously known as split toning. Right here, we can add a color with certain saturation to the shadows, to the midtones, or to the highlights. Now, just remembering the analysis, we had those greenish or yellowish casts added to the shadows. Meanwhile, the entire image was a bit cool. So what we're going to do is add that cool tone into the highlights and into the shadows, that green cast. So shadows, first of all, we can add some saturation. Obviously, this is way too high, but I like to add more saturation just to play around and find the correct tone. So the value is going to be right here in the lemon range, just in the middle of the greens and the yellows. The hue is going to be 72, and obviously the saturation is way too high. Maybe an 8% is going to be enough. And in this particular image, we don't see this green cast applied because basically all the image is in the highlights. It's being classified as highlights, but in darker images, it's going to be very noticeable. Now in the highlights, I'm going to add this blue tone just to make the image a lot cooler. Most of the images shot with the LomoChrome 92 are very cool, with the exception of interior photos. So just going to add the hue around the 235, and the saturation is going to be quite high because we're going to just layer up some of the saturation towards the skies as well, because, well, mostly the skies are going to be classified as highlights. So saturation is 39. So we can see the before and after, and immediately you can notice how the skies are a lot more vibrant, a lot more saturated compared to the original. And in general terms, the image is a lot cooler than the original one. Now, final step, we're going to add the grain, because this image, well, it basically has a very fine grain. We're going to move down to effects. Now in effects, here we have grain, and we can add some quantity first of all, because it has a very noticeable and quite distracting grain. So maybe around the 42, and then the size is way too small. So we're going to go up around the 70. And then roughness will add more contrast between the particles. Right here, you can notice how we have white particles and black particles for the grain. And with roughness, we add more contrast between them. So this is way too high, maybe an 80% is going to be enough. And there we have our image with the effect of the LomoChrome 92. So let's save the preset and apply it to a couple other images to see if we did a good job, because if you create a preset in a single image, it could be deceiving and it could not work in other scenarios. So you need to modify it. So let's save the preset first. Go to the left panel on the presets, hit the plus sign, create preset. And right here, remember, you want to mark every single slot that you edited. So exposure, white balance, and contrast, we didn't use them, so we're not going to mark them. Highlight, shadows, all of these we are, just as color grading, color mixer, effects, and camera calibration. Okay, so we have this colorful image in California. We have reds, we have blues, greens, everything I want to check. So let's apply the LomoChrome 92, which, as you can see, is already in the Light V3. This is the before and after, and we can see the difference. Blues are a lot more vibrant and saturated. Greens are more towards the emeralds. Then the reds a bit more towards the magentas. And then we have this green yellowish cast in the shadows with this very nice film grain. So in this image, it works quite nice. In this image of my dogs, in a bit more of an underexposed scenario, we can notice that cool cast added to the entire image. We lose some information in the highlights, which is okay. This is what we were looking for. A very harsh contrast, and those blacks are very faded out. It looks perfectly over here, not to mention the greens towards the emeralds. Over here in this photo of this lonely woman just looking at the sunset in Seville, let's apply the preset. And there we have it, and it looks fantastic. You can notice the difference in the sky, which is a lot cooler, what we were looking for. We still have a bit of overexposure, but that's okay. And we have some loss of information in the shadows with that green cast added to the entire image. So if you compare it to the unedited original image, we have a very similar and natural contrast, but this is digital photography, so it would be tempting to ump the shadows towards the positives to have more detail. But right here, what we're achieving is a flatter exposure. Instead, we want more contrast, so I'm just going to return it. We want that contrast for the LomoChrome 92. Finally, skin tones. Let's see the skin in this model. Over here, let's apply the preset. And before and after, we can see those greens, we can see those blues, a bit more vibrant, those fade out blacks, and the skin tones are a bit more towards the magentas with a little bit less yellow. So this preset is quite harsh, very punchy, contrasty, and dramatic, but it isn't unusual for different styles of photography. For portraits, for landscapes, for street photography, I think it works quite well. So there you have it, guys. This is how I would achieve the colors from the LomoChrome 92 applied into my digital photography. So I hope you achieved some knowledge out of this. And remember that this preset that we created, it's in the Edit Preset Pack V3 and the Analog Preset Pack. Link up here to my shop. Also up there, you're going to find my personal presets and LUTs that I use every single day. So if you find something that you like, I'll be very thankful if you can support me. If not, just like the video, share it with a friend, subscribe, all those things. I'm Tony Fuentes. Cheers to all of you, and I'll see you in the next one.